The restaurant on Madison Street went quiet when Lefty Ruggiero pulled the gun from his jacket. Across the table sat Donnie Brasco, the young jewel thief who had been running jobs with Lefty's crew for the past 3 years, who had become like a son to the aging mobster, who had just been proposed for full membership in the Bonanno crime family. The weapon, a snub-nosed .38 revolver, sat between them on the red-checkered tablecloth next to the remains of their pasta dinner. Lefty's hand rested on the grip, his eyes locked on Donnie's face, searching for something he prayed he wouldn't find. "I'm going to ask you one time," Lefty said, his voice low and steady despite the tremor in his hand. "And you better tell me the truth, because if you lie to me now after everything, I swear to Christ I'll put one in your head right here." The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. The question that could end either Donnie's life or Lefty's world. The question that would determine whether the past 6 years had been real or the most devastating betrayal in mob history. Joseph Pistone had been an FBI agent for 7 years when he volunteered for the undercover assignment that would consume his life. It was September 1976, and the Bureau's New York office was desperately seeking ways to penetrate the 5 families that controlled organized crime in the city. Traditional investigative methods, wiretaps, informants, surveillance, had provided limited success against organizations built on blood ties, ethnic loyalty, and a code of silence enforced by death. What the FBI needed was someone inside, not an informant who could be controlled or turned, but a federal agent who could become a made member of the Mafia, gather evidence from within, and dismantle the structure from the inside. The assignment required someone willing to disappear into a false identity for years, someone who could lie convincingly to men who killed liars, someone who could befriend criminals and betray them, and someone whose psychology could withstand the isolation and moral complexity of living a double life. Joe Pistone raised his hand because he believed he was that person, though he couldn't have known the cost of being right. The FBI's plan was built around a simple concept. The Mafia valued certain skills, particularly those that generated income, and jewel thieves occupied a specific niche in organized crime's ecosystem. They operated independently, but needed fences to move stolen merchandise, and those fences were often connected to mob families who took percentages in exchange for protection and market access. A skilled jewel thief looking to expand his operations would naturally seek mob connections, making the approach seem organic rather than engineered. Pistone's cover identity, Donnie Brasco, would be a small-time thief from California, trying to establish himself in New York. Ambitious enough to seek mob partnership, but not so successful that his lack of verifiable history would seem suspicious. The Bureau created a complete background, criminal records in California under the Brasco name, contacts in the West Coast underworld who would vouch for him if questioned, an apartment in New York, and seed money to fund the lifestyle of a working criminal. They gave him 6 months to make initial contact with low-level mob associates, establish credibility, and begin the penetration. They expected the operation to last perhaps 2 years before his cover was burned, or the danger became too extreme. No one anticipated it would consume 6 years of his life and reach depths of criminal organization that no law enforcement agent had ever accessed. Pistone spent the first weeks of his undercover life in bars and social clubs in Little Italy and Brooklyn, where mob associates congregated. He dressed the part, expensive but not flashy, jewelry that suggested income but not wealth, the carefully calibrated presentation of a working criminal who made decent money but wasn't trying to draw attention. He played cards, bet on sports, bought drinks, and inserted himself into conversations with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in criminal environments. His FBI training had included extensive preparation, studying mob culture, learning Italian-American slang, understanding the hierarchy and protocols of organized crime, and practicing the psychology of deception under stress. But the real education came from immersion, learning to read the subtle signals that indicated whether someone was connected or just pretending, understanding when silence was required and when participation was expected, and developing the instinct for danger that separated survivors from casualties in the world he was infiltrating. The break came in early 1977 when Pistone met Anthony Mira at a bar in the Lower East Side. Mira was a soldier in the Bonanno family, a violent and unpredictable criminal with a reputation for brutality that made other mobsters wary of him. He had noticed Donnie Brasco around the neighborhood, observed him winning at cards, and heard him casually mention dealing in stolen jewelry. Mira needed money and saw potential in this young thief who seemed competent and unaffiliated with competing families. He approached Donnie one night and asked whether he needed connections to move merchandise. Pistone responded carefully, expressing interest while maintaining the cautious distance of someone who understood that wrong partnerships could prove fatal. He mentioned having access to quality stones from jobs in California and being interested in expanding his New York operations if he could find reliable buyers. Mira suggested they talk business, and just like that, after 4 months of patient cultivation, Pistone had his first genuine mob contact. Working with Mira provided entry, but also presented immediate dangers. The man was paranoid, violent, and unpredictable, characteristics that made him simultaneously useful as a contact and dangerous as a partner. He would fly into rages over perceived disrespect, test Donnie constantly to gauge his reactions and reliability, and demand that he participate in various criminal enterprises beyond jewelry theft, including hijacking trucks and collecting debts through threats and violence. Pistone navigated these demands carefully, participating enough to maintain credibility, while finding ways to avoid situations that would require him to commit serious crimes that the FBI couldn't legally authorize. He reported everything to his handlers, meeting them secretly in hotel rooms and parking garages where they would debrief him, assess the intelligence he was gathering, and evaluate whether the operation should continue or the risks had become too extreme. The information he provided about Bonanno family operations was valuable, but the FBI wanted deeper penetration, access to higher-ranking members who made strategic decisions and controlled the family's major criminal enterprises. The operational breakthrough came when Mira introduced Donnie to Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero in the spring of 1977. Lefty was a soldier in the Bonanno family, a career criminal who had been with the organization for over 30 years, participating in murders, racketeering, loan sharking, and gambling operations that formed the foundation of mob income. Unlike Mira, who was volatile and feared, Lefty was respected within the family, trusted by leadership, and connected to the hierarchy in ways that could provide exactly the access Pistone needed. He was also, at 55 years old, facing a crisis of relevance in an organization that valued earning capability above loyalty. His gambling addiction had left him perpetually in debt, despite decades of criminal income. His health was declining, and younger mobsters were moving into positions of influence while he remained a soldier, never elevated to capo despite his years of service. When Mira brought Donnie Brasco around, Lefty saw opportunity, a young earner he could mentor and sponsor, someone whose success could improve Lefty's standing in the family, and whose loyalty might provide security in his declining years. Their first meeting occurred at a social club in Little Italy, where Bonanno members gathered to conduct business away from surveillance. Lefty studied Donnie carefully during that initial conversation, asking questions about his background, his skills, and his connections in California. Pistone's answers were consistent with the legend the FBI had created, specific enough to seem authentic, but vague enough to resist detailed verification. He mentioned jobs in San Francisco and Los Angeles, dropping names of criminals who were actually FBI contacts, prepared to confirm his story if questioned. He demonstrated knowledge of jewelry, discussing the quality of stones, the challenges of moving high-end merchandise, and the markup structures that made theft profitable. Lefty was impressed not just by Donnie's apparent competence, but by his demeanor, respectful but not obsequious, confident but not arrogant, the bearing of someone who understood the protocols of organized crime without being explicitly taught. After 2 hours of conversation, Lefty made a decision that would change both their lives. He told Mira he wanted Donnie working with him instead, effectively taking control of the promising young thief and relegating Mira to the background. The relationship that developed between Joe Pistone and Lefty Ruggiero over the next months was complex and psychologically layered in ways the FBI had not anticipated. Lefty didn't just see Donnie as a business associate or criminal partner. He adopted him as a surrogate son, teaching him the intricacies of mob life, introducing him to important members of the Bonanno family, and vouching for him in situations where Donnie's lack of verifiable history might have raised suspicions. He explained the rules that governed organized crime, how respect was earned and maintained, which insults required violent response and which could be overlooked, and the difference between a friend and a friend of ours, the coded language that distinguished civilians from made members. He brought Donnie to family weddings and funerals, to sit-downs where disputes were resolved, and to meetings with capos who controlled family operations. And he shared aspects of his personal life, his disappointments with his sons who had rejected the mob lifestyle, his frustration at remaining a soldier despite decades of service, and his hope that sponsoring a successful young criminal might finally earn him the respect and elevation he deserved. Pistone found himself genuinely liking Lefty, despite the moral contradictions that created. The man was a criminal, complicit in murders and violence that had destroyed lives across decades of mob activity. He spoke casually about killings he had participated in, about victims who had been shot or stabbed or beaten to death for violations of mob protocol or simple business disputes. His worldview was shaped by a code that valued loyalty to the family above all other considerations, that saw civilians as resources to be exploited, and that accepted violence as a legitimate tool for resolving conflicts and maintaining control. Yet he was also capable of genuine warmth and generosity, buying expensive dinners he couldn't afford because hosting mattered in mob culture, lending money to friends despite his own desperate financial situation, and showing Donnie a loyalty and affection that felt authentically paternal. Pistone understood intellectually that Lefty's kindness toward him was based on a lie, that the relationship was fundamentally transactional from Lefty's perspective, an investment in someone who might improve his position in the family. But the emotional reality of their interactions, the meals they shared, the conversations about life and loyalty, the moments when Lefty would put his arm around Donnie's shoulder and call him kid with obvious affection, created psychological complications that no FBI training had prepared him for. The deeper Pistone penetrated into the Bonanno family structure, the more he recognized the organization's complexity and reach. The Mafia wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a parallel government that controlled entire neighborhoods, industries, and labor unions through a combination of violence, corruption, and strategic infiltration of legitimate businesses. Family members owned restaurants, construction companies, and trucking firms, that served as both income sources and vehicles for money laundering. They controlled unions in the garment district, at the waterfront, and in the construction industry, extracting payments from businesses that needed labor peace, and using union positions to facilitate theft, bid rigging, and contract manipulation. They operated loan sharking networks that charged extortionate interest rates to desperate borrowers, gambling operations that generated millions in untaxed income, and protection rackets that forced businesses to pay for security against threats the mob itself created. The organization's power derived not just from its willingness to use violence, but from its ability to corrupt legitimate institutions, police officers who provided warnings about investigations, union officials who facilitated criminal enterprises, and politicians who blocked reforms that might threaten mob interests. By late 1978, Donnie Brasco had become a trusted member of Lefty's crew, participating in various criminal activities that generated income for the family while gathering evidence that would eventually destroy it. He helped move stolen jewelry through fences connected to the Banana organization, participated in truck hijackings that netted merchandise worth hundreds of thousands, and collected payments from businesses under mob protection. Every operation was documented in detailed reports to his FBI handlers, creating a paper trail of criminal activity directly connected to specific mob members. But the intelligence Pistone provided went beyond individual crimes. He was mapping the family's organizational structure, identifying who reported to whom, which capos controlled which operations, and how decisions flowed through the hierarchy. He attended meetings where family business was discussed, where territories were negotiated, and where strategies for new criminal enterprises were developed. He witnessed the internal politics of the organization, the rivalries between ambitious members seeking advancement, the tensions between old guard mobsters and younger criminals who wanted to expand into new areas, and the constant calculations about loyalty, respect, and violence that governed mob relationships. The FBI's expectations for the operation evolved as Pistone's penetration deepened. What had begun as an effort to gather evidence for racketeering prosecutions was now producing intelligence about mob activities across multiple states and criminal enterprises. Pistone's reports documented connections between the Bonanno family and operations in Florida, where mobsters were investing in legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises in the state's growing cities. They revealed mob involvement in the drug trade, particularly heroin importation and distribution, an area that traditional Mafia leadership had historically avoided, but younger members saw as highly profitable. They identified corrupt law enforcement officers and public officials who provided protection and intelligence to the organization. And they captured the casual brutality of mob culture, the beatings administered for minor violations of protocol, the murders ordered to resolve business disputes or eliminate potential informants, and the absolute requirement for obedience to family leadership, regardless of personal cost. The personal toll on Pistone grew more severe as the operation extended beyond its original timeline. He was living two lives that became increasingly difficult to separate, spending weeks at a time undercover with minimal contact with his wife and 3 daughters, missing birthdays, holidays, and the daily experiences of family life that defined normal existence. His marriage strained under the pressure of his absences and his inability to explain what he was doing or when the assignment would end. FBI regulations prohibited him from telling his wife the details of his undercover work, leaving her to manage their family alone while he disappeared into a criminal world she couldn't understand. When he was home, which became increasingly rare, he was psychologically elsewhere, his mind still processing the conversations he'd had, the intelligence he'd gathered, and the dangers he was navigating. his daughters grew up largely without him, seeing him as an occasional visitor rather than a constant presence, and the guilt of those absences compounded the stress of maintaining his double identity. The psychological complexity of his situation intensified as his relationship with Lefty deepened. By 1979, Lefty trusted Donnie completely, sharing confidences about his financial problems, his disappointments with his sons, and his frustrations with the family leadership that had never elevated him despite his decades of service. He confided that he was seriously in debt to loan sharks, including some connected to other mob families, and that the pressure to pay was becoming dangerous. He asked Donnie for loans, which Pistone provided using FBI funds, knowing that refusing would damage their relationship and potentially expose his cover. Lefty spoke about getting old, about the young criminals coming up who didn't respect the traditions and protocols that had defined mob culture, and about his hope that Donnie would take care of him if his health failed or his debts became insurmountable. The conversations were intimate in ways that made Pistone deeply uncomfortable, not because they revealed criminal activity, but because they revealed a human being whose trust he was systematically betraying, whose loyalty to him was genuine, even if it was built on a false foundation. In early 1980, Lefty proposed Donnie for membership in the Bonanno family. The proposal was a massive breakthrough from an investigative perspective and a profound complication from a personal one. Becoming a MAID member would provide Pistone with access to the organization's highest levels, to meetings where strategic decisions were made, and where evidence gathered could lead to prosecutions of the family's entire leadership. It would represent the deepest penetration of the American Mafia by law enforcement in history, but it would also require Pistone to participate in a murder. The traditional requirement for becoming a MAID member, proof of absolute commitment to the organization and willingness to accept the death penalty that awaited anyone who violated omerta, the code of silence. The FBI could not legally authorize an agent to commit murder, and Pistone had no intention of killing anyone, regardless of authorization. The situation created an operational crisis. Refusing the proposal would insult Lefty and potentially expose Donnie as either uncommitted or worse, an informant. Accepting would create expectations he couldn't fulfill. The Bureau decided to stall, having Pistone express honor at the proposal while suggesting the timing wasn't right, given ongoing business complications. If you're still here, watching this moment of impossible choices, if you understand what it means to live a lie so deep, you risk forgetting the truth, go ahead and like this video and comment the word loyalty below. Let's see how many of us recognize that sometimes the most dangerous disguise is the one that fits too perfectly. The identity that feels real even when you know it's false. The friendship that matters even though it's built on betrayal. The stalling strategy bought time but increased pressure within the family for Donnie to prove his commitment. Lefty explained that other members were asking questions about his protege, wondering why this capable young earner hadn't been proposed for membership earlier, and speculating about whether there might be problems with his background or his loyalty. Some members, particularly those connected to crews that saw Lefty and Donnie as competition, began making inquiries about Donnie's past, contacting associates in California to verify his criminal history and his connections. The FBI's preparations held up under scrutiny. Their contacts in the West Coast underworld confirmed Donnie's story, and the criminal records they had created appeared authentic under examination. But the increased attention created danger. The more people who looked carefully at Donnie Brasco, the greater the likelihood someone would notice inconsistencies or gaps that might trigger deeper investigation. Pistone reported the situation to his handlers, and they began discussing exit strategies, ways to extract him from the operation before his cover was compromised, and his life became immediately forfeit. The operational landscape shifted dramatically in May 1981, when three Bonanno capos, Alphonse Sonny Red, Indelicato, Philip Philly Lucky Giacconi, and Dominic Big Trin Trinchera, were murdered on orders from the family's leadership. The killings were the culmination of an internal power struggle that had been developing for months, a conflict between the family's official boss, Philip Rusty Rastelli, who was imprisoned but still directing family operations, and the faction led by Sonny Red, who believed leadership should pass to those actually on the street running daily operations. The three capos were lured to a meeting in Brooklyn, under the pretense of resolving tensions, then shot to death in an ambush coordinated by loyalists to Rastelli's leadership. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves that wouldn't be discovered for years. The murders sent shockwaves through the Bonanno organization, eliminating senior leadership and creating vacancies that reshuffled power throughout the family. For Pistone, the killings provided extraordinary intelligence about the family's internal dynamics and confirmed the ruthlessness with which mob leadership maintained control. But they also increased the danger of his situation by eliminating members who might have provided counterweight to others who were more suspicious of Donnie's background. Lefty was devastated by the killings, not because he was particularly close to the murdered capos, but because the power struggle had created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion, where anyone might be targeted based on perceived loyalty to the wrong faction. He explained to Donnie that the family was in a vulnerable state, that law enforcement would certainly be investigating the disappearances of three senior members, and that everyone needed to be extremely careful about what they said and who they trusted. The irony of Lefty warning an FBI agent about law enforcement scrutiny was not lost on Pistone, but he played his role perfectly, expressing concern about the situation and asking how they should protect themselves. Lefty's response revealed the depth of his trust. He told Donnie that as long as they stayed loyal to each other and to the family's leadership, they would be protected. He said that Donnie was like a son to him, and that he would never let anything happen to him. The statement, offered with genuine emotion, was one of the most difficult moments of Pistone's undercover life. Receiving declarations of loyalty and protection from a man he was systematically betraying, whose words of affection would ultimately contribute to his destruction. The FBI began planning the operation's termination in late 1981. Pistone had been undercover for more than 5 years, far longer than originally anticipated, and the Bureau believed they had sufficient evidence for massive prosecutions under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The intelligence he had gathered documented criminal activities involving more than 100 mob members across multiple families, provided organizational charts that mapped the entire structure of the Bonanno organization, and captured recorded conversations that demonstrated clear patterns of racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, gambling, and conspiracy to commit murder. Legal analysts estimated the evidence could support indictments of the family's entire leadership and potentially dozens of soldiers and associates. The question was how to extract Pistone without immediately identifying him as the source of the intelligence, a question that had no perfect answer. The moment arrests began based on information only Donnie Brasco could have provided. Every mob member he had associated with would know he was either an informant or a federal agent, and the consequences would be catastrophic for anyone who had vouched for him or brought him into family operations, particularly for Lefty Ruggiero. Mob protocol was absolute on this point. If you brought someone into the family and that person turned out to be an informant or agent, you were responsible. The penalty was death, not negotiable, not subject to appeals or explanations. It didn't matter whether you knew the person was an informant or were deceived along with everyone else. Your responsibility was to verify, to ensure through whatever means necessary that the people you vouched for were legitimate. And if you failed in that responsibility, you paid with your life. Lefty had not only vouched for Donnie, he had sponsored him, introduced him throughout the organization, and proposed him for membership. When the truth emerged, Lefty would be marked for execution, and no amount of pleading or explanation would save him. Pistone understood this with painful clarity. The man who had treated him like a son, who had trusted him completely and protected him within the organization, would die because of that trust. The psychological weight of that knowledge was crushing, made worse by the fact that there was no way to prevent it. No warning Pistone could provide that wouldn't immediately compromise the entire operation and potentially get himself killed. The extraction plan the FBI developed was designed to create ambiguity about Donnie's fate, rather than immediately revealing his true identity. They would stage a scenario where Donnie appeared to flee because of heat from law enforcement, unrelated to the Bonanno family, making it seem like he was running from other legal problems, rather than cooperating with authorities. The hope was that this might create enough doubt to delay mob retribution against Lefty while the Bureau prepared for arrests. It was a thin hope, and everyone involved knew it. The Mafia's intelligence networks included corrupt law enforcement officers who would likely inform the family about FBI activities, and the timing of arrests following Donnie's disappearance would make the connection obvious. But it was the best option available in a situation where no good options existed. Pistone agreed to the plan, while privately resolving to do everything possible to ensure Lefty survived the aftermath, even though he had no idea how to accomplish that. The final phase of the operation began in July 1981, when the FBI started making preparations for mass arrests. They coordinated with federal prosecutors in New York to prepare indictments based on Pistone's evidence and testimony. They identified which mob members would be arrested first, targeting the leadership to disrupt the organization's command structure and prevent coordinated responses. They made security arrangements for Pistone and his family, knowing that the moment his identity became public, they would need witness protection and would essentially disappear into new lives under new names. And they scheduled the announcement of the operation's success for maximum public impact, planning a press conference where the FBI director would reveal that an agent had spent 6 years inside the Mafia, gathering evidence that would dismantle one of New York's 5 families. The announcement would be a public relations triumph for the Bureau, demonstrating capabilities that organized crime had believed were impossible. But for Pistone, it would mean the end of an identity he had inhabited for so long. It had become part of him, and the beginning of a life defined by what he had lost, rather than what he had gained. His last meeting with Lefty occurred in early July, at a restaurant in Little Italy, where they had eaten dozens of meals over the years. Lefty was worried about money as always, complaining about his debts and the pressure from loan sharks who were threatening violence if he didn't pay. He asked Donnie whether they could put together a quick score, maybe a jewelry job, that would generate the cash he desperately needed. Pistone felt the conversation's terrible irony. Here was a man who had spent his entire adult life in organized crime, who had participated in murders and countless other serious crimes, now begging for help from the FBI agent who was about to destroy him. Pistone wanted to warn him, to tell him to run or hide or somehow prepare for what was coming. But saying anything would compromise the operation and potentially endanger other agents and informants whose safety depended on the element of surprise. So instead, He promised to work on finding them a good opportunity, knowing the promise was a lie, knowing this was likely the last conversation they would ever have. The surveillance photograph captured them leaving the restaurant that night. Lefty's arm around Donnie's shoulders, in a gesture of affection that would become evidence in the case against the Bonanno family. They walked to Lefty's car, talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, and then said goodbye. Donnie watched Lefty drive away, a 60-year-old career criminal who had never risen above soldier, despite decades of loyalty and service, whose trust in a young jewel thief represented both his last hope for significance and the instrument of his destruction. Pistone felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that this chapter was ending, guilt about the betrayal it represented, and sadness for a relationship that had been both genuine and completely false. He walked to where his FBI handlers were waiting in an unmarked car and told them he was ready to come in. The operation was over. Donnie Brasco would cease to exist, and Joseph Pistone would return to a world that no longer quite fit after 6 years of living someone else's life. The FBI's announcement came on July 26, 1981, at a press conference in New York that revealed the operation's scope and success. The Bureau disclosed that Special Agent Joseph Pistone had spent 6 years undercover as Donnie Brasco, had penetrated the Bonanno crime family to an unprecedented depth, and had gathered evidence that would support more than 100 federal indictments. The announcement shocked both law enforcement and organized crime communities. No one had suspected that Donnie Brasco was anything other than what he appeared to be: a small-time jewel thief who had worked his way into the mob's lower ranks. The revelation that he was a federal agent who had successfully deceived the organization's leadership for 6 years represented a catastrophic intelligence failure for the Mafia and a triumph for the FBI. News coverage was extensive, with media outlets describing it as the most successful undercover operation in FBI history, and speculating about the impact on organized crime in New York and beyond. The impact on the Bonanno family was immediate and devastating. Federal prosecutors began unsealing indictments that charged more than 100 members and associates with racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, gambling, conspiracy, and murder. The indictments were based primarily on Pistone's testimony and the evidence he had gathered during his years undercover, supplemented by surveillance and wiretaps that corroborated his accounts. Senior leaders were arrested, including acting boss Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, who had also vouched for Donnie and would pay the ultimate price for that endorsement. Operations that had generated millions in criminal income were disrupted as members went into hiding or were taken into custody. The family's organizational structure, which had evolved over decades, was exposed in federal indictments that detailed exactly who controlled which operations and how decisions flowed through the hierarchy. Other families watched nervously, wondering whether Pistone had gathered intelligence about their operations during his 6 years inside the Bonanno organization, and whether they might face similar prosecutions. For Lefty Ruggiero, the announcement was a death sentence. The moment word spread that Donnie Brasco was an FBI agent, Lefty knew his life was over. He had brought Donnie into the family, had vouched for him repeatedly, and had proposed him for membership. By mob protocols, he was responsible for the catastrophic security breach, and the required penalty was execution. He went into hiding immediately, moving between safe houses and avoiding locations where mob assassins might find him. But he also knew hiding was temporary. The organization would find him eventually, and when they did, he would be killed as an example to others about the consequences of failing to properly vet associates. Federal prosecutors offered him witness protection, the opportunity to testify against other mob members in exchange for safety and a new identity. Lefty refused, not out of loyalty to an organization that had marked him for death, but out of pride and identity. He had been a mobster his entire adult life, and he would die as one rather than become a rat, the lowest form of life in the value system that had defined his existence. Sonny Black Napolitano, the capo who had also vouched for Donnie, faced the same fate but with fewer illusions about his options. He understood mob protocol perfectly and knew that disappearing or cooperating with authorities would only delay the inevitable while destroying any legacy he might leave. Instead, he made peace with his fate. He put his affairs in order, said goodbye to people who mattered to him, and waited for the summons he knew would come. In August 1981, approximately 1 month after Pistone's identity was revealed, Sonny Black was called to a meeting in Brooklyn. He dressed carefully that morning, wearing jewelry and his best suit, and told his girlfriend he probably wouldn't be coming home. At the meeting location, he was shot multiple times, and his body was dumped in a creek in Staten Island, where it was discovered days later. His hands had been cut off, a symbolic punishment in mob culture for bringing an FBI agent into the family, for shaking hands with a rat and introducing him to other members. The murder sent a clear message to anyone else who might have been deceived by Donnie Brasco. The organization accepted no excuses and granted no mercy for security failures. Lefty survived longer than expected, partially because federal authorities arrested him before the mob could reach him. He was indicted on multiple charges based on Pistone's evidence and testimony, facing decades in prison for racketeering and conspiracy. At trial, he was confronted with recordings of conversations he'd had with Donnie, with testimony from the man he had treated like a son, and with evidence of crimes he couldn't deny because the details were too accurate to dispute. The experience broke him in ways that physical violence had. He maintained his refusal to cooperate with authorities, would not testify against other mob members even when offered reduced sentences, and accepted conviction and imprisonment rather than violate the code that had governed his life. But privately, friends noted he was destroyed emotionally, betrayed by someone he had genuinely loved and unable to reconcile the Donnie he had known with the FBI agent who had systematically deceived him. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, where he would serve his time until failing health led to early release. He died in 1994, having never recovered financially or psychologically from the operation that had exposed his life's work as service to an organization that would have killed him, without hesitation if federal authorities hadn't intervened first. Joseph Pistone entered witness protection with his family immediately after the operation became public. The threats against him were credible and specific. The Bonanno family put a $500,000 contract on his life, an extraordinary sum that attracted professional killers across the country. Other mob families, fearing he might have gathered intelligence about their operations during his undercover years, added their own contracts. Pistone received death threats daily, his family was targeted, and FBI security assessments concluded he could not safely live under his real name anywhere in the United States. He and his wife and daughters were given new identities, relocated to an undisclosed location, and instructed never to contact anyone from their previous lives. The transition was devastating for his family, who lost all connections to friends, extended relatives, and the communities where they had lived. His daughters lost their schools, their friends, and any sense of normalcy. His marriage, already strained by 6 years of his absence during the undercover operation, fractured further under the stress of witness protection and eventually ended in divorce. The legal proceedings that resulted from Operation Donnie Brasco extended over several years and resulted in more than 200 indictments and over 100 convictions. Pistone testified in multiple trials, providing detailed accounts of criminal activities he had witnessed and participated in during his 6 years undercover. His testimony was extraordinarily credible because it was so specific, describing conversations, meetings, and operations in detail that could be corroborated by surveillance and other evidence. Defense attorneys attacked his credibility, arguing he was a liar by profession who had deceived everyone he encountered for 6 years and whose testimony therefore couldn't be trusted. But juries found him convincing, perhaps because he didn't minimize his own role in the deception or present himself as a hero. He acknowledged the moral complexity of what he had done, admitted that he had genuinely liked some of the men he was betraying, and accepted that the operation had required him to commit smaller crimes to maintain his cover and gather evidence about more serious ones. The operation's success transformed FBI approaches to organized crime investigation. Before Donnie Brasco, the Bureau had believed deep, long-term penetration of mob families was impossible, that the organization's ethnic insularity and violent enforcement of omerta made them effectively immune to infiltration by agents. Pistone proved that assumption wrong, demonstrating that with proper preparation, psychological resilience, and willingness to commit years to a false identity, an agent could penetrate even the most security-conscious criminal organizations. The Bureau developed new training programs based on lessons from the operation, teaching agents the psychological techniques required for long-term undercover work and the security protocols necessary to protect them. They launched additional undercover operations targeting other crime families, though none would achieve the depth or duration of Pistone's penetration of the Bananos. And they recognized the personal costs such operations imposed on agents and families, developing support systems intended to help operatives transition back to normal life after extended periods undercover. For Pistone personally, the operation's aftermath was complicated and psychologically difficult in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, had gathered evidence that dismantled a major crime family, and had proven capabilities the FBI hadn't known it possessed. But the success came at enormous personal cost. His marriage ended. His relationship with his daughters was damaged by years of absence, followed by the trauma of witness protection. And he struggled with guilt about the men he had betrayed, particularly Lefty Ruggiero. He understood intellectually that he had done his job, that the men he helped convict were criminals who had themselves destroyed countless lives through violence and exploitation. But the emotional reality was more complex. He had lived as Donnie Brasco for 6 years, had experienced genuine friendships within that identity, and had seen the humanity in men whose criminal actions he despised. The cognitive dissonance of holding both truths simultaneously, that the mob members were criminals who deserved prosecution, and that some of them had shown him genuine kindness and loyalty based on false premises, was psychologically exhausting. He eventually wrote a book about his experiences, Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia, published in 1988, which provided detailed accounts of the operation and his time inside the Bonanno family. The book was remarkably honest about the moral and psychological complexities he had navigated, acknowledging the toll on his family, his genuine affection for Lefty, despite knowing the betrayal he was engineering, and his struggles with guilt about the consequences his testimony had produced. It became a bestseller and was adapted into a 1997 film starring Johnny Depp as Donnie Brasco and Al Pacino as Lefty Ruggiero. The film captured some of the operation's emotional complexity, particularly the relationship between the agent and the mobster, though it simplified and condensed events for dramatic purposes. For Pistone, watching actors portray the most intense period of his life was surreal. Seeing his experiences transformed into entertainment that audiences consumed without fully understanding the real costs involved. The Bonanno crime family never fully recovered from the operation's impact. The prosecutions removed an entire generation of leadership, disrupted operations that had functioned for decades, and created paranoia about infiltration that made recruiting new members and associates extremely difficult. The family's influence declined relative to other New York crime families, and internal power struggles following the arrest created further instability. Some members blamed the organization's problems on having strayed from traditional protocols, arguing that proper vetting would have identified Donnie Brasco before he penetrated so deeply. Others recognized that Pistone had been extraordinarily skilled at his deception, had been supported by FBI resources that created a virtually undetectable false identity, and had exploited vulnerabilities, particularly Lefty's desperate desire for a successful protege, that were inherent to the organization's structure rather than individual failures. The debate was ultimately pointless. The damage was done, the family was crippled, and organized crime in New York would never operate with the same confidence that had characterized the decades before Donnie Brasco. Years later, after leaving the FBI and emerging from witness protection, Pistone reflected on what the operation had taught him about loyalty, identity, and the costs of deception. He acknowledged that becoming Donnie Brasco had required him to suppress aspects of his authentic self and embrace characteristics: the willingness to lie convincingly, the capacity to betray trust, the ability to participate in criminal activity without internalizing criminal identity. That didn't come naturally. He had to become someone else so thoroughly that the performance became reality, at least temporarily. The experience taught him that identity is more fluid than most people recognize, that we contain multitudes, and that circumstances can draw out versions of ourselves we didn't know existed. But it also taught him about the costs of living inauthentically, of maintaining relationships based on deception, and of betraying trust even when the betrayal serves a larger purpose. The guilt about Lefty never entirely faded, even though he understood intellectually that he had done his duty, and that Lefty's fate resulted from Lefty's own choices to participate in organized crime. The question he was asked most frequently in interviews and public appearances was whether it had been worth it, whether the operation's success justified the personal costs to himself, his family, and even to men like Lefty who had been deceived and destroyed. His answer evolved over the years, but settled on a nuanced position that acknowledged multiple truths simultaneously. From a law enforcement perspective, the operation was unquestionably successful, gathering evidence that led to hundreds of convictions and significantly damaging organized crime's infrastructure in New York. From a personal perspective, the costs were devastating, destroying his marriage, damaging his relationship with his children, and leaving psychological scars that never fully healed. From a moral perspective, the calculation was complex. The men he helped convict were criminals who had themselves caused tremendous suffering through violence, extortion, and exploitation. But they were also human beings, capable of loyalty, affection, and kindness, at least toward those within their circle, and destroying them required destroying those human connections along with their criminal activities. The legacy of Operation Donnie Brasco extends beyond the specific convictions and organizational damage it produced. It demonstrated that even the most secretive and violent criminal organizations can be penetrated by law enforcement willing to commit the resources and accept the risks inherent in deep undercover work. It showed that the Mafia's power derived not from invincibility, but from perception of invincibility, from the belief that omerta and ethnic loyalty made the organizations immune to infiltration. Once that perception was shattered, once it became clear that the person sitting across from you at dinner or standing next to you at a wedding might be an FBI agent, gathering evidence for your prosecution, the psychological foundation of mob operations was fundamentally undermined. Trust became suspect, relationships became potential threats, and the bonds that had held the organizations together for generations began to fray. The operation also revealed something profound about human nature and the construction of identity. Joseph Pistone became Donnie Brasco so completely that aspects of that identity remained with him decades after the operation ended. Friends noted he sometimes slipped into Donnie's speech patterns or mannerisms, that certain situations triggered responses from his undercover identity rather than his authentic self. Psychologists who studied his case suggested that 6 years of intensive role-playing had fundamentally altered his personality, not replacing Joseph Pistone with Donnie Brasco, but creating a hybrid identity that incorporated both. The experience demonstrated that we are who we pretend to be, at least partially, that sustained performance of an identity eventually transforms the performer. This truth is both liberating and terrifying, suggesting that we have more agency in constructing ourselves than we might assume, but also that we can lose ourselves in performances that begin as strategic choices. In the end, the story of how an FBI agent infiltrated the Mafia by posing as a jewel thief is about more than just law enforcement or organized crime. It's about the human capacity for deception and trust, about the costs of living inauthentically, even in service of legitimate purposes, and about the moral complexities that arise when right actions produce devastating consequences for specific individuals. Joseph Pistone destroyed a criminal organization and helped convict hundreds of dangerous criminals. But he also betrayed the trust of men who had shown him genuine affection, ended careers and lives of people who had welcomed him as family, and paid personal costs that included the loss of his marriage and years of estrangement from his children. Both truths coexist without canceling each other out, creating a moral landscape far more complex than simple categories of hero and villain can accommodate. The restaurant on Madison Street, where Lefty had pulled his gun, turned out to be a moment that never actually happened outside Pistone's nightmares. But the psychological truth of that imagined scene, the confrontation where Lefty would finally ask the question and Donnie would have to decide whether to maintain the lie or confess the betrayal, haunted Pistone for years. In reality, he never had to face Lefty after the operation became public, never had to see the hurt and betrayal in the eyes of the man who had treated him like a son. That absence of confrontation was both a mercy and a burden, sparing him the immediate emotional impact, but denying him any opportunity for explanation or closure. The relationship simply ended, terminated by a press conference, and replaced by legal proceedings, where Pistone testified about criminal activities he had witnessed while betraying the trust of the witness. What remains decades later is a complicated legacy that resists simple interpretation. Operation Donnie Brasco was the FBI's most successful organized crime investigation, a triumph of patience, skill, and courage that demonstrated capabilities no one knew federal law enforcement possessed. It was also a deeply human story of deception and trust, of relationships built on lies that were nonetheless emotionally real, and of costs that extended far beyond what anyone anticipated when Joseph Pistone first volunteered for an undercover assignment expected to last 6 months. The operation changed organized crime investigation damaged the Bonanno family beyond recovery, and transformed everyone it touched. The agent who lived a lie for 6 years, the mobster who trusted him and paid with his life, and the families who lost husbands and fathers to either bullets or prosecutions. The evidence gathered led to justice, but justice proved insufficient to resolve the moral and psychological complexities the operation created, complexities that follow everyone involved for the rest of their lives.